Hello, everyone. We're at 2 minutes past the hour, so I'm going to get started. Welcome to session 2, Back from the Edge, How to Avoid Funding Cliffs and Look Toward the Funding Future. I want to get started. First of all, hi, introduce myself. I'm Zahava Stadler. I focus on state level education funding policy for the Education Trust. And I want to start with an opening poll to get a sense of where people think the planning discussions are at in their state. So if you were in the previous session and you took a look at your state's ESSER plan, this might be helpful, but I'm more trying to get a sense of the tenor of the conversations. What are people feeling in terms of the challenges? So I've just put up this poll. I'm going to give people about 90 seconds to respond just to see how people are hearing and sensing the conversations in their states. Responses are coming in. This is really interesting to see. So I'll put up the results in about 30 more seconds when people have finished considering how they want to answer. So while a decent number of people are not familiar with their state's current planning, and I think that that's a real comment on the transparency and how effective the public engagement process has been so far, that the most common response is, we're still trying to figure out what to do with all that money. There's a sense that this is a lot of money, an unprecedented amount of federal investment in education, and it's about trying to figure out how to spend it and where to put it, and we've got to do this quickly maybe, and we don't really know what we're doing with it. And I hope that our first presentation from Allison and Kayla gave you a sense of some of the most productive ways to invest that money in accelerated learning. And we're also going to be hearing in the next session from some activists who are working on how to help states think about centering special populations in their comeback planning. But for the purposes of thinking about what the funding is and how to use it in ways that don't trigger a funding cliff, I think this actually, there's a silver lining here, which that it gives us some time for planning to use the money responsibly. That if the conversations are on the plane of what do I do with all this money, that there is a moment here, a window for advocates to think creatively about how to engage in those conversations to help nudge their states in the right direction. So I'm going to take us to the session agenda, and here just the basic overview is, first of all, anticipating the funding cliff. Why do we think this is something we need to spend any time talking about? Why am I anticipating a funding cliff and freaking everybody out? Number 2 on our agenda is responsible spending. There are a lot of people who are afraid right now that a coming funding cliff means they can't do anything big. And that's definitely not true. But we do want to talk about what responsible spending looks like. Third is a reminder that this federal aid is not the whole universe of money that districts can look to. And so we want to spend a fair bit of our time today looking at how to secure state dollars to keep things going. And I'm going to encourage you to think about what a push for those dollars could look like in your state as I make some suggestions. And of course, there'll be time at the end for questions. So as we go along, please feel free to put questions in the chat or the Q&A box. And when we get to the end of the session, we'll spend some time addressing those questions. So anticipating the cliff. This is a lot of money. but it is also important to understand and put those dollars in perspective. So ESSER money, which is the big heading for the 3 big tranches of money going to states and especially to school districts, specifically for education comeback. This adds up on average to about $3,650 per pupil across the country. That number excludes certain special streams of funding for students with disabilities and students experiencing homelessness, which we'll hear more about in the next session, but this is the core education support. And this average hides a lot of variation based on districts' characteristics and the concentrations of poverty among students that they serve. But on average, this is the number we're talking about. So you have 4 school years ending in the fall of 2024 to finish spending all of this money. And depending on your district's budget cycle, that could overlap with anywhere from 4 to 6 fiscal years. So conservatively, let's say you're spending over 4 years. If you divide that money equally, that's a little over $900 per student per year. Definitely not pocket change, and it's a big increase in district's federal funding, but it is not game-changing or reinvention money as a percentage of the per pupil average dollars that were spent last year, or rather in 2019, which is the most recent year for which we have federal spending data. It's about a 6% bump on average per year over those 4 years. Of course, you don't have to spend it evenly over the 4 years. You can spend it faster or unevenly. So let's say a district wanted to make a big one-time investment that would take the lion's share of the money in that first year. They could do that. And so you could conceptualize it as a 1-year, 24% funding increase. But of course, that's only if you want to use it all up front. So in other words, thinking about this money requires careful planning and reasonable expectations. But I did say that that average hid a lot of variation. So let's see who's getting how much per pupil just around the country. What's the distribution? There are close to 1,000 districts that are getting no ESSER funding at all because they have very low levels of student need. That means essentially they're not getting any Title I dollars in a regular year. That means they're not really serving a notable number of students in poverty, which means they're not eligible for this number. There are a lot of districts in the $1,000 to $4,000 per pupil range. But especially high need districts are getting more money per pupil. So Buffalo, New York is close to $9,000. Phoenix, Arizona's elementary school district is just over $9,000 per pupil. Benton Harbor, Michigan is hovering right around $10,000 per pupil. So there are districts that are receiving much bigger allocations per pupil because they're serving students with more profound needs. Every district will need to navigate their own planning here, but it is important to consider how large an increase this funding really is in different districts, given both the size of the money they're getting and also what their baseline budget was before. The other thing to consider when anticipating the funding cliff is what money actually have districts gotten here and how much is going away. So this is not just about the end of the federal education aid. It's not just about ending a special boost and then going back to normal. So if you reach back eons to the early days of the pandemic, you may have seen some articles or headlines where the main fear was about state economies taking a nosedive, which would result in a big state budget cut that would impact schools. That was the fear. In most places, that didn't happen. In fact, we saw this big raft of headlines in state and national publications about how the budget projections for 2021 and 2022 were actually way better than people expected. Things were looking very promising. Why did that happen? That's not because state economies were magically unaffected by the pandemic. What we should not underplay here is the role that federal aid through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan played in propping up state budgets. And I'm not just talking about direct aid to state governments here. I'm talking about the ground level support that people got. So people got checks and spent them on sales taxable goods. Their unemployment benefits were subject to state income taxes. The aid that went to businesses fed into corporate income taxes or business licenses, payroll taxes, employees' personal income taxes. So what we're seeing is that the federal aid maybe played a larger role than people are giving it credit for in making sure that state budgets stayed healthy. But those other supports are going away far sooner than 2024. In some states, they've already gone away. So we have yet to see how the post-pandemic economy may align, but we shouldn't presume that state budgets will be back to normal in any simple way. So we're not just talking about a boost of direct education aid that's going away. We are also talking about the underlying state of the economy reasserting itself once these things that have propped it up start to fade. Okay, so what's the upshot of that? Responsible planning includes two main concerns. First of all, as states think about how to spend, they need to think about spending responsibly in the short term, which means in part spending short-term money on short-term needs or one-time investments. But there's also the question for the long term, how to find or raise or free up other money to continue the expenditures that districts and states have begun to make with the short-term money they're getting now, keep the good stuff going, and also how to shore up state education budgets in anticipation of a fall off beyond the end of direct federal aid. So if we're expecting that the underlying state economy has been buoyed by this federal support that I was talking about, that's going to affect district budgets going forward. And that's something that states need to be planning for, getting their revenues in line. So when I talk about responsible spending, I'm not going to dwell too much on this because the other presentations today are focused more on the how of these spending and planning decisions. So I'm just going to talk about some big picture things that states and districts should consider as they make choices about how to use this funding. Here are some things to think about. One is pacing. How do you want to space this money out over 4 years? Or do you want to make big upfront investments? Do you want to spread them out evenly? How will your funding plan escalate and ramp down compared to your regular growth in school district budgeting? Concern two is beware of recurring costs. So if you make long-term commitments with short-term money, that may be unsustainable. So ongoing personnel costs, especially like new full-time hires, pay raises, benefits increases, these hiring priorities are actually cropping up in a lot of LEA plans for what to do with this money, and that is definitely something to watch. So if districts are making these commitments only with the short-term funds, then that's an unsustainable thing and something we should be careful about. So the question is, are districts making those commitments? And if they are they identifying regular funds to sustain those commitments? So things to consider instead, potential one-time investments. A good example is facilities improvements, right? A big overhaul to your HVAC system or dealing with a lead pipe problem or things like that. This is a great opportunity with a big one-time infusion of cash to make a big one-time investment. Shorter term investments in addressing unfinished learning. So this is the kind of thing where temporary extended learning time programs or short-term contracts for things like tutoring personnel or community partnerships. So those are not long-term recurring commitments that you're making with short-term money, those short and medium-term investments. And then longer-term initiatives that you'd love to have them going on, but they have big startup costs. Maybe there are big initial technology investments, equipment purchases, training costs, where getting something off the ground is expensive, but you're going to be able to maintain the lower regular costs of keeping it going after that startup. So this big infusion of money might be an opportunity to cover those big startup costs, and then you'll be able to keep it going out of your regular budget. Okay, so that was the short-term stuff, responsible spending in the short term. But let's move on to long-term concerns. And this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time, which is securing state dollars going forward. There are options for how to find or raise or free up funding to continue expenditures and to shore up state education budgets. So on the state side of this advocacy equation, states should be responsible in planning for those funding cliffs that are coming and that extend beyond the loss of direct federal funding, both the education specific aid and the other kinds of federal aid we've been talking about that have buoyed education budgets. On the district side, any recurring commitments that districts are making, especially any unavoidable recurring commitments that districts are making, responsibly need to be paired with advocacy around the options for securing state money that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to advance 3 approaches here on how to secure state money, roughly in order from the lowest hanging fruit to the highest hanging fruit. And as we talk about it, I'd really like people to be thinking about how viable these approaches might be in your state. Who would you want to involve in an effort to make them happen? There will be a quiz at the end. I'm going to be asking people to ponder that directly after we hear about the strategies and share about that in the chat. So here's the first strategy for securing state dollars. There are a lot of states that when they have made changes to their school funding policies, there are holdover elements that tie up state money, often tying up state money in districts that no longer need as much support. So that kind of thing should be targeted for cleanup, for elimination to free up state money for core educational services. So things like that might be a hold harmless provision where, yeah, we're making big changes, but don't worry, everybody will still get what they used to get. We'll just make some changes with the new money going forward. When Pennsylvania reformed its funding formula a few years ago, when Illinois reformed its funding formula a few years ago, they have a big hold harmless. That's the foundation of this new policy where everybody's still getting what they used to get, plus new money going through a new formula. That means that a lot of state money is going to places that don't need it in the same way they used to. And that is a place where we could be really recouping a lot of money for different kinds of education concerns. So that's a real sort of promising, and this can be sold as efficiency and modernization and things like that, but targeting things like that for cleanup can really free up state money for more pressing needs. So this is just sort of a low-hanging fruit to consider for targeting for advocacy. Number 2 is finding new revenue sources. And people often propose new revenue ideas for education, but some of the usual suspects are really not well suited to this moment. So what we often hear people talking about are excise taxes on particular products. You often hear people mentioning cigarettes, marijuana, and alcohol as things to target for specific taxes to support education. And these are pretty regressive taxes. They fall pretty heavily, research suggests, on people from low-income households. And it's always a bad time to implement a regressive tax, always, but it is an especially bad time to implement a regressive tax during a pandemic that's falling so heavily on the backs of low-income people. I would say the exact same thing about lotteries. Lotteries are basically a tax on low-income people in disguise. If that's a provocative thing to say, you can email me and we can fight about it later. But really, lotteries raise very little money for schools, and the bill is really footed entirely, or not entirely, but very heavily by people from low-income backgrounds. Another very common place to look is what are called severance taxes, which is code for taxes on energy and natural resources. This is a very tough thing to do while energy prices are going down. This isn't a very productive time to tax those things. So it's important to think a little bit outside the box. Possibilities could include, and obviously these things are not all equally well suited to different political contexts, but these are some possibilities. So targeted taxes on income. So I have here a campaign sign for the Prop 208 campaign from last year in Arizona, which was a successful ballot initiative to raise taxes on high earners, specifically to benefit education. There's news coming out this week that the Washington, D.C. City Council is progressing towards an income tax on high earners to support social services. Things like that are great progressive options to raise additional money for education. A little bit of a wonkier version of this, more targeted taxes on real estate transfers. A real estate transfer tax is basically a sales tax on a property you buy. And lots of states have them, but very few have a progressive rate. So if you buy a house worth $80,000, you're paying the same percentage of that in taxes as if you buy a house worth $800,000. That could be made a lot more progressive to support education. taxes on capital gains, investment money, estate taxes. Most states have backed off estate taxes, but only a minority of states have them. And then taxes on select services. So services that are used by high income people, like tax preparation, financial advising, even massages, that might be currently exempt from sales taxes. These are great and promising ways to think about how to raise progressive funding for education. So here's strategy number 3. And this is where I'm going to get maybe a little bit farther afield, but I really want people to think about this seriously, because it's something that is actually less unprecedented than you think and really powerful. So many of you probably know that a substantial share of education funding comes from local property taxes. So a school district border doesn't just define, here's the area where kids go to these schools and this is the area overseen by the school board. It's also a taxing jurisdiction. It says this is the geography of property that we're going to tax for these schools. And proceeds from local property taxes stay within the districts where they're raised. So that means that if you have a district with $1 million mansions, they're going to have a much, much easier time raising a lot more local property tax money than a district with much more modest houses. And because most states keep all of that money within the school district borders where they're raised, that means that that money, the property tax dollars raised in wealthier districts, really stays locked within those districts. And that often shortchanges students of color, specifically because of America's history of racial discrimination in home ownership, things like redlining that to keep families of color from buying homes in certain neighborhoods, or a history of discrimination in how the federal mortgage program or federal home loans were administered. All of that has produced lower home values and therefore less local school funding in communities with more students of color. So that is a big, big equity problem. But it doesn't mean that there isn't money to be had. It just means that it's not being sent to the places that need it the most. Allowing local property taxes to flow across district borders would get that money to where it's needed in advance of a funding fall off. And it would do that without having to raise taxes at all, just about redirecting the money that we have. So here's a quick visual that might be helpful. So last year, the school funding organization EdBuild, which is no longer a going concern, but where I used to work, did a study, and among other things, found that when you have a county with multiple school districts in it, so right in the same area, right, a single county, if it's got multiple school districts in it, the average gap in local revenue is over $6,300 per pupil. That's how unequal things are on the ground. Within a single county, the average gap between the highest and lowest property tax receipts per pupil is over $6,000, right? When I say that there is money to be had, it's just not going to the places that need it the most. This is what I'm talking about. You have huge, huge disparities on the ground. And as you can see from the graphic, the higher value the property, the much more easily that district can sort of fill its property tax bucket. So what happens if you set that money free? If you share those local dollars at the county level, if you pool them across the district borders, even at a statewide level, not on a county level, that enables those dollars to buoy the whole system and reach the students most in need. So EdBuild actually found that if you did this in all states, choosing either county level pooling or state level pooling based on whichever advantages more students, you see 69% of students get the same or more money under a pooling arrangement, including 76% of low-income students and 73% of students of color. So those overwhelming numbers tell you how many kids the system is not working for right now. And remember, this is all just pooling existing dollars, no tax increases, no state budget changes. If you just let that money flow across district borders to other school districts in the county or state, you would see about 70% of kids would get a boost. So some states really have already moved in this direction. Vermont pools all of its education tax revenue at the state level. Nevada recently changed policy to pool all education tax money at the state level. Michigan pools some property taxes for education at the state level. Wyoming shares money at the county level, property tax money at the county level across multiple districts. There's a county in Delaware that does this as well. Basically, this is not a new concept. And of course, we have lots of states, especially in the South, that already have county level school districts. The notion of pooling property tax money at the county level for schools is not a brand new one, but it's one that states, especially in the Northeast and Midwest, really have yet to embrace. And there is such potential here to recoup money for schools and districts that are serving higher need populations. So there's really no justification, I think, for some school districts to be totally flush with cash, while others that often serve the students with the greatest needs face this looming prospect of shortfalls when federal money goes away. So I want now to push people in the chat to plan your approach. So we've got a room full of advocates here. And I'd like to get you thinking about how, as an advocate for better policy in your state, you could move this forward and hopefully also help people spark others' ideas by sharing this in the chat. So I want to spend about 5 minutes asking you to fill out in the chat 2 things. One, who is the influencer, whether that's a legislator or a journalist or a state official or a prominent civic leader, somebody else who's a thought leader in your state or community. Who would you go to about these ideas? The ideas of 1, cleaning out outdated elements in school funding policy, 2, tapping new and progressive state revenue sources, or 3, pooling the existing local dollars at the county or state level. Who would you go to about those ideas? Who would you go to find out what problems currently exist in your specific state policy that could be rectified here? And to identify areas of opportunity, and who and how would you go about fixing them? What would you ask these people to do, research, consider, change about current policy? So I'm going to give people 5 minutes to really consider that and think about who and what they want to be asking. I'm seeing a proposal from California that given the small school districts in California, that we could be thinking about widening those taxing borders from local districts to counties to make local funding more equitable. And California has an especially weird status quo policy, I just want to say, where they kind of pool this money at the county level and then hand it back to districts, not based on current wealth, but based on the wealth levels they had in 1979, which makes no sense on any level. So there is definitely work to be done in states like California. I'm especially curious if anybody who keeps an eye on the legislative conversations in their state has been hearing the same thing for a long time. Sometimes these things get caught in a rut, state policy conversations, and maybe those are places to really think about strategy number 1, targeting for cleanup the holdovers from old systems. I'm seeing an interesting parallel coming from a New York City advocate about how within New York City, things are not based on local property taxes because, of course, New York City is one district. But that a few years ago, some council members were advocating to combine all PTA fundraising dollars rather than keeping them for the individual school. That's a great way to think about transposing this idea to the level where you're advocating, and think about how does it function at the school level, at the community level, as well as at the district and state level. And yeah, that push turned into a political minefield because things get complicated when people feel invested. PTA members feel invested in their state fundraising. Yeah, in terms of suggestions for who to reach out to, I'm seeing the heads of our the State House Academic and Finance Committees to have them look at state pooled taxes. And this doesn't need to be an immediate revolution, right? You don't have to say, okay, all property taxes for education are now state taxes. So the way this happened in Michigan was there was a bit of a trade back in the 90s where local property taxes for education were capped. So a lot of people saw a tax cut at the local level. And then a new property tax of 0.6% was instituted at the state level specifically to fund state education dollars. So you can do kind of a swap there where you think about, hey, it's a tax cut here, a little bit of an increase there. Everybody gets a tax cut overall, but actually it's much more fair because there is a significant number of dollars that are being pooled across the state. One comment from Delaware, I had mentioned that one of the counties in Delaware does a county pool, but they haven't done a lot of recalculation of how that money's handed out. So she's commenting, we need to unfreeze that county pool in Delaware to do a better job of getting that money out equally, and also to think about legislators considering the kind of progressive tax options that we're talking about, rather, moving the conversation away from those regressive sin taxes and lotteries and things like that. Yeah, I'm seeing a comment from Wisconsin that that everything really is based on property taxes. And even as a former school board president and a county board member, there's never been any conversation of property tax pooling that he's been involved in. And I think that's really important. Wisconsin actually bills its school funding system as being all about property tax fairness, and yet this isn't even something they're considering. And I think that this is really about getting away from some of the habits of mind and the ruts that we have about the kind of policy that we're going to talk about. Yeah, and the talking points that people have advanced, we need to spend less money on prisons and more money on schools, and that's really powerful. And I think that the goal is to advance the next thing to the how. How do we get that money into the hands of the people serving the kids that need it the most? Because just moving money from this column to that column in a state budget spreadsheet does not ensure equity. And so thinking about that, thinking about the progressive ways to raise and distribute that money, I think is really powerful. It's not just about the top line number. It's not just, oh no, we're going to see a fall off in a few years. How can we raise more money? First of all, I would love for more states to get to that place, but that can't be the end of the conversation, right? We need to be thinking about raising money from the right places, making sure it gets to the right places so that the overall picture is more just and equitable at the end of the day. So I really appreciate people's engagement in the chat. I want to make a final pitch. Everyone is understandably focused on how to use their ARP dollars right now. They've got this this federal money coming in, and everybody's focused on that. And when I had the opening poll, there was a lot of, what are we going to do with all this money, right? Is the tone that people are hearing. There's a big scramble to try and use the money for good things. And this may feel like a weird time for me to tell you to think about 2025. But I'm telling you, this is actually the perfect time for you to think about 2025, because now is the time to start this conversation. While there's time to advocate, while there's time to pursue legislative change, while the federal money is available to help bridge that transition for people, to help districts navigate their way through funding policy changes, the money that's here in the state set aside could really be helping districts navigate that change. And especially while districts and families can link their advocacy for state investment to the cause of sustaining the good and valuable efforts that they're beginning right now. We're talking a lot in the first session we had, in the third session we're going to have, we're talking a lot about the best way to use this money, the good things we could and should be doing to support students through this time. And those things are great advocacy points for, okay, we don't want this to go away in 2024. We're doing good work here. So we're trying to be responsible with the money we have, but we also want to pair that with advocacy for sustaining these efforts with the money going forward, whether we're making that advocacy around modernizing and cleaning up the state funding system that's tying up state dollars in places where it doesn't need to be, whether we're talking about targeting new potential revenue streams that are progressive and fair and tapping the right kinds of things, or whether we're talking about moving existing money across school district borders to share it in a way that benefits the vast majority of kids. So all of that advocacy can be linked to the cause of sustaining the good and valuable things that districts are just beginning to do right now. So this is a great time to make that pitch. And funding policy change does not happen overnight. It's going to take a little while, and that is why getting into the conversation right now, ahead of the funding cliff, being realistic, being pragmatic, and also being able to be hopeful and looking towards the future and putting out that positive vision, this is the perfect time to do it. So I want to open up to questions. I know in big webinars, everybody's sort of reluctant, but I appreciate the engagement we've had in the chat so far, and I want to invite people to chat questions either in the Q&A box or in the regular chat, and we'll do our best to address them. I'm going to stop share here. And as Allison said earlier, everybody will be getting a copy of the slides in the recording, but we'll also be sharing contact information for the presenters to follow up. But I just really do want to encourage people to think if there's anything they want to get in under the wire before we close the conversation. So I'm seeing that a lot of districts need to submit plans in June and August for different ESSER things. Any suggestions for timing of advocacy efforts? So I want to say this really depends on the level at which you're operating. So we heard a lot of frustration at the end of the last session for those who are here that the state level plans are kind of vague, but that's because in part, that the vast majority of this money is going straight to districts. So thinking about advocacy at the LEA level, if you're a local advocate, to be talking about how to use this money. So there are two levels of advocacy here. One, advocacy around the how. So those responsible spending choices, that could be starting right now. It could be starting yesterday. It could be, now that you have these materials, this is a great time to engage as districts are preparing those plans. But also thinking about advocacy for advocacy. So I was saying that this is a great time as districts advance plans for great initiatives that they're getting started to also think about pairing that with advocacy for the state investment that will make those things sustainable. And I think that that's a mind frame that a lot of LEAs are not in right now, because there's this big conversation about, hey, there's so much money sloshing around, we don't even know what to do with it. I think that those numbers about how this is big money, important money, but not permanent game-changing money, that's a good reality check. We're trying to do great things with it, and we want to encourage our LEA representatives, right? Our school boards associations, our superintendents, to pair really strong, robust, impressive level LEA level plans with advocacy for state investment that will help them keep it going forward. I'm being asked to talk about the role of philanthropy and helping with the challenges surrounding the funding cliff. I think this is a really interesting point, that there may be initiatives that districts can use the federal money over the first couple of years to establish a proof of concept that something is a really high leverage, valuable thing for their community, and to attract philanthropic investment from going forward to keep it going. That said, I'm not letting states off the hook. So this is very important, I think, to say. Many of you probably know there is no federal right to an education in the United States, but every single state constitution guarantees public schooling, that it is states that bear the responsibility of educating kids equitably and well. And that I think that there is a great role for philanthropy here, but I don't want to let states off the hook for that kind of important investment. I am also thinking, how should schools think about the proposed increase in Title I funding? Could it help address the funding cliff? This is a great advocacy point, that right now we're talking about short-term money that is explicitly going to expire in fiscal year 24. But there are really important proposals in play in the federal conversation right now, coming from the Biden administration or on the table in the House of Representatives, about big significant increases in funding to Title I, to the federal money that goes to schools and districts serving students from low-income backgrounds. That could definitely help address the funding cliff. And I think that there's an opening for advocates at every level here, right? If you are a local advocate, you can be talking to your LEA leadership about their LEA plan and their advocacy for the state. If you're a state level advocate, then this is something where thinking about the state investment, you can take that directly to your state stakeholders. And if you're a federal advocate, then holding up great examples of robust and important initiatives that are being done with this federal investment is a great way to really bolster the cause of a Title I increase. So we have another question. Has there been any thinking on the infrastructure bill? Should districts hedge their bets on getting more dollars for facilities? I am nobody's federal psychic here. I wish I knew what was going to happen with the infrastructure bill. I will say that the deadline here for using this money in the existing federal education aid, the ESSER money, is for districts to obligate the funds. So big construction projects can take a long time. I've even seen some press reports of superintendents saying, how could we possibly make any investments in school construction when we only have a few years? It takes a long time to build a school. The answer is, as far as I can tell from reading the guidance here, is that money needs to be obligated, which means basically you need to have the contracts in place with the people who are going to be making those capital improvements. You don't have to be finished with your project. And it also means there may be time in the interim to move some money around. A Wisconsin advocate is pointing out that the recent state budget gave zero increase of state money to schools, and instead that money is going into local property taxes, local property tax reductions, basically states using the federal investment as an excuse not to invest in schools. And this is really regrettable. I think that the advocacy point has to be around looking forward, right? This money is meant to, looking backward and looking forward, meaning this money is meant to help districts recover. This has been a really tough time. This is not money for filling gaps left when the state pulls back. In fact, that is illegal under federal law. There are maintenance of effort requirements. There are maintenance of equity requirements, meaning states cannot just cut because they see money coming in the door. So it's not quite the same thing as refusing to invest further, which I also think is a mistake. But I think that the spirit of maintenance of effort is important, and then thinking ahead a few years to saying things like, this money is going away, but you're setting a precedent that's going to be with us for years, is important, because it's really hard to raise money once you've sent it out the door. So thinking about the balance of that conversation. I'm also getting a question in the Q&A about examples of cobweb remnants, meaning what are some examples of places that have some outdated policies that could be cleaned up here. So sometimes these are Sometimes these are small things like despite the fact that such and such school districts, population has really shifted. They're not serving nearly as many students as they used to, but we're still sending that money in perpetuity to districts based on the number of students they had 30 years ago, because otherwise it would be a cut. That's a cobweb. I would say another thing is states are generally make an attempt to structure funding so that places with higher property values get a little less state aid and vice versa. They try to do that. So one interesting example is in Missouri, the formula is structured that way, but if you haven't had an increase in property value at all in the last 16 years, they don't pay any attention to that, meaning you could have seen massive increases in your property values and the state will still be sending you state aid as though your property is frozen at the value it had in 2005. I know that that's a little bit of a wonky example. These cobweb things do tend to be sort of fine print things, but it's why in a way they're low-hanging fruit. If you can sort of get in the weeds on them, you can find that there's a lot of money seeping through the cracks on these things that can be redirected to communities with greater needs. So that is all the questions I am seeing right now. I really want to thank everybody for their engagement here. And I'm sure that so Tara Wallen, who's an Associate Director of Policy for the Education Trust, will be moderating a great panel with some advocates for special populations coming up. So I hope everybody will stick around for 3 o'clock Eastern when we get going.